Okay, everyone, so we're starting chapter 13 today, which is arguably the most important chapter that we're going to be learning about this year. It is going to cover the time period called antebellum America. Now, even though your textbook doesn't refer to this time period as antebellum America, it is very important to also know this terminology. Okay, so essentially the word antebellum means before war. And perhaps the most iconic war that the United States has been in is the Civil War, when America goes to war against itself. Okay, so essentially 13 is the lead up to the Civil War and all of the antebellum events that made the Civil War inevitable. Okay, so this chapter is called The Politics of Separation, 1850 to 1861. So these years are significant because 1850 is going to be the year that California is admitted as a state, and it's really going to revive this conversation that's taking place in the United States on slavery. And then it ends in 1861, the year that the Civil War itself begins. Okay, now keep in mind that division in the United States has been very strong already. We've been talking about sectionalism ever since the Market Revolution. And so to be honest, we've discussed it even with the colonies, right? Even though we didn't call it sectionalism at the time, the North definitely has a different character, right, than the South does. Okay, these differences are going to start to kind of get deeper and deeper and cause more tension leading to the Civil War. So our chapter objective today is to demonstrate an understanding of the growing split between the North and South that led to secession and Civil War. Okay, so again, the word secession simply means that a state wants to leave the nation. So they want to break away and leave the Union. Okay, so we first learned this word in the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812, and also John C. Calhoun threatened secession during the nullification crisis of 1832. Okay, so the Civil War is basically when the country is at war with itself. All right, like I stated, the very first date of this particular chapter is 1850, and the reason why it is 1850, California is ready for statehood at this point. Okay, now I know it seems really weird, right? Because we didn't just add California as a territory 2 years after the Mexican-American War, right? So, we just acquired that. So keep in mind, though, California already has a very high population of Americans as a result of the gold rush. So they were almost instantaneously ready to be admitted as a state. Now, here's the reason why California's potential statehood is causing a lot of tension, though. So remember, Mexico did not allow slavery. Okay, so that was one of the reasons why the Texas Revolution had started. So there are no slaves in California. Okay, so at this time in 1850, when California is applying to become a state, there are 15 slave states and 14 free states. Okay, so again, if we look at this map here, so this is where you had slavery, and this is where slavery does not exist. Okay, now you might think that, okay, it makes sense to add California as a free state, and then it will be sort of even 15 and 15. But here's the worry that the South has. Okay, so the South knows that California is not going to be the only land that is eventually going to become a state. Okay, so America gets these other territories from Mexico too, right? So like Utah and New Mexico. And because Utah and New Mexico used to be part of Mexico, those two territories also do not have slaves either. Okay, so if we add California as a free state, it's almost opening the door to Utah and New Mexico as free states too. And the South is worried that they would then lose their advantage because they've always sort of had a majority. They've always had this advantage with the 3/5 clause, or ever since the 3/5 clause in Congress. Okay, so you might be wondering, right, what about the Missouri Compromise, right? So how come we don't just, acknowledge that 3630 line? Okay, so again, that line applies here. Okay, now keep in mind, when the Missouri Compromise had passed, the United States had only included the Louisiana Territory. Okay, so everything east of that and this Louisiana territory. So when it was created, the Missouri Compromise line, right, which is right here, it's only intended to be for this area. Okay, so it's no longer going to really apply to the case of California, because also if we're to sort of extend that line, we're not going to cut California into two different pieces, right? So that doesn't sound like it makes much sense, okay? California's statehood is really going to revive the conversation about slavery. So let's take a look at 13.1 and 13.2 today. Okay, so 13.1 from union to disunion. So what happened, right? So that's going to divide the country, and we need to know what's going to divide the country, okay? So analyze the political jockeying in Congress and how reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act and the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin changed the opinions of many Americans South and North, making a break between them hard to avoid. So again, this chapter is really, really important. This section is really important. There's a lot of different events that you're just going to simply need to know, okay? So we've already talked about the rise of abolitionism, and of course, abolitionism is the goal of abolishing or getting rid of slavery, and it greatly is sort of impacted by the Second Great Awakening. So preachers are saying slavery is morally wrong, right? There were different tiers of abolitionists, and probably the most extreme or the most radical, so literally they're referred to as sort of radical abolitionists, okay, are those who want to end slavery everywhere right now. Okay, so radical abolitionists would be William Lloyd Garrison. Let's just get rid of slavery everywhere. Now, moderate abolitionists are more in the free soil category. Okay, so people like Martin Van Buren. Free soilers or moderate abolitionists said, okay, slavery can exist where it already is because it's been there for so long, so let's just leave it there. But how about we don't have any slavery in the new lands that we're acquiring or adding to the United States, okay? So those new territories. And then there are abolitionists who, say like, they know slavery is bad, but they just don't see it as a major problem, right? It's not sort of a priority for the United States. It's not something that needs to be addressed, okay? So yeah, America should eventually get rid of it, but it's not something we need to do at this moment right now. Okay, so regardless of which tier of the abolitionists, people were in at all, abolitionists could agree that they preferred what's called free wage labor. Okay, so what that means is, white men who are free are working for wages instead of forced slave labor. Okay, so the difference between free labor and slave labor. Free labor, people are free and they're going to be getting wages for their work. Slave labor obviously do not get paid. They're slaves. Okay? So that's just the difference. Now, an early abolitionist who would fall into that free soil category was David Wilmot. Now, David Wilmot actually had the idea of free soil even before the Mexican-American War happened. Okay, now when the United States Congress was voting whether or not to go to war, David Wilmot actually proposed the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, so please, you just have to know this event, all right? So in 1846, as the United States was entering into this war against Mexico, David Wilmot and his Wilmot Proviso proposed that when we win this war, okay, because he was just that confident that it's going to happen, okay, that there should be no slavery in any of the land that we're eventually going to get from Mexico, okay? So he's very sure that we're going to get this land, and slavery doesn't exist there in Mexico at the time, and he definitely doesn't want to see slavery be extended there once the United States wins, okay? Now, he is a free soiler. Okay, so he believes in free labor, and he's also from the North. So as a Northerner, he is not going to want more slave states giving the South advantage when it comes to, presidential elections and representation in Congress. So When the Wilmot Proviso went for a vote in Congress, all of the Northern Democrats and the Whigs voted in favor of the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, so however, it does not pass. Okay, now why is this important to know? Well, number one, it shows us that there were early attempts to abolish slavery, even if it was a moderate abolitionist attempt. But secondly, here's where things are getting a little different from what we've seen before. Notice that the Northern Democrats and the Northern Whigs are voting together. Okay, so Democrats and Whigs who don't like each other are now sort of supporting the idea in the case of slavery, and this sort of sectionalism between the North and the South, right? Loyalty to their part of the country, the North, right, is sort of trumped. So the political parties are loyal to the cause of abolitionists or abolitionism. Okay, so people don't vote on what's going to be best for Democrats or what's going to be best for Whigs. They voted in favor of the North, essentially. Okay, so the Wilmot Proviso does not pass, but it definitely shows us that there's issues in terms of sectionalism within the United States. Okay, so what are we going to do with that land now? Okay, so how is California going to be admitted then as a state? Well, luckily we have our good old Henry Clay, the great compromiser, who would come up with a compromise for us. And it is called the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so Henry Clay, in constructing the Compromise of 1850, decides to have 4 different items in the compromise. So you have to understand 4 items altogether, 2 of which are going to help the North and 2 of which are going to help the South. Okay, and then everybody is going to be happy. Okay, so that's the goal. So Henry Clay says, let's go ahead and we'll add California as a free state. They are already free. Okay, so that's obviously going to satisfy the North and make the North happy. And then he said, how about we leave Utah and New Mexico as territories? Okay, so again, California will be a free state. Utah and New Mexico will just remain territories. They will not be organized as states for the time being. Okay, so that means that they do not get to vote in Congress. So it would not give the North any advantage, so the South would be happy. Okay, so again, the North is not getting an additional vote or anything like that from these states, so the South is going to be happy because these are not going to be free states. Okay, so notice so far we have 1 point for the North and 1 point for the South in a way. Okay, now in the third clause, it says that the Compromise of 1850 would abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So in our nation's capital, you're no longer able to buy or sell slaves. Okay, so the North is going to be very happy about that. So the North sort of has 2 points now in favor of this compromise. Okay, the South has 1. So finally, Henry Clay created the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act is essentially a stronger version of the Fugitive Slave Clause that was already included in the Constitution. Okay, now we're going to spend more time talking about the Fugitive Slave Act in a little bit, but just so you know, the South is going to be happy with this. So now it's sort of 2-2. Okay, so both the North and the South, they get 2 things that they both really wanted. Okay, now this should settle it sort of once and for all. Millard Fillmore, the president who took over after Zachary Taylor dies, calls the Compromise of 1850 the final settlement, right? He believes that after Henry Clay crafted this compromise, slavery would never again be an issue in the United States, ever, right? We finally did it. We solved the issue of slavery, but he could not have been more wrong. Okay, so let's talk about the problems that the Compromise of 1850 actually caused. Okay, now remember, the very last part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. And so let me tell you just how it was different from the Fugitive Slave Clause that was actually in the Constitution. Okay, so the Constitution establishes that slaves are property who have to be returned back to their owners. Okay, so a fugitive is a runaway slave and they should be taken back to the South. Now, the stronger Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in 1850 as a part of the Compromise of 1850, it now authorizes federal agents to go out and actually capture runaway slaves. So now the federal government is not just saying that runaway slaves have to be returned. They're saying that runaway slaves must be returned, and now people who are working for the federal government are working as slave catchers. Okay, so they're going to go to the north, look for these fugitive slaves, and anyone who's found to be helping these runaway slaves, people like Harriet Tubman and or other conductors on the Underground Railroad, they're now committing a federal crime, and they could be fined or sent to jail for helping, like the Underground Railroad. Okay, so now, Southern support for this Fugitive Slave Act is very weird and sort of ironic, because what the Fugitive Slave Act does is it gives the federal government more power. Okay, but typically speaking, the South hates strong federal government, right? But in this case, it helps them out, right? And so what many slave owners are going to do is they're going to post posters and they're going to say, here's my runaway slave, help me find them. And then these agents are going to go out and, seek to find them, okay? Now let's talk about one of these runaway slaves and what happened to them. So one individual is a man named Anthony Burns. Anthony Burns was a runaway slave from the South. He was a fugitive and he moved up north and went to Boston. And the reason why he goes to Boston in particular is because, number one, it's the city of freedom in a way, right? So it's the center of the American Revolution. But Massachusetts was, also one of the first states to abolish slavery. Okay, so there's a big community of free blacks already living in Boston. Okay, so he's looking for, he's working in Boston. He gets a job there. He's well respected by his peers. But then, so federal agents found him. So they caught him and they return him back to slavery. Now this causes riots all around Boston because people are like, wait, Anthony Burns is our friend. He's a good guy. He's lived in Boston. You can't just take him back down to the South and return him to a life in slavery. Okay, so when this is witnessed, because remember, many Northerners, even though they don't like the idea of slavery, they're detached from it, right? But slavery is happening kind of far away, right? So they never really get to witness it. But when they see someone that they considered sort of a neighbor, a friend, a part of their community, be returned to slavery, it causes more Northerners, especially in Boston, right? Again, that sort of rowdy, city, to become abolitionists. So, maybe they're like, one of the others, or, we're like one of those others where it's just, yes, slavery, it's bad, but it's not a priority. But now they're going to start seeing that it is a major priority. Okay, so the story of Anthony Burns is going to create more abolitionists in the North. Now, another major event that's definitely going to change the way Northerners view slavery is the publication of something called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, so memorize these three words, Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most important books that we're going to learn about all year. So it's written by a white female author. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. So essentially, Harriet Beecher Stowe is living in the North, and she was living in an area where many runaway slaves are sort of passing through as a result of the Underground Railroad. And she saw these fugitive slaves. She heard of their stories. She heard about how bad, this slavery really is. And she decides that she needs to write a book about it. So she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is going to be a kind of, story of a slave by the name of Uncle Tom, who was at the mercy of his evil master, Simon Legree. So she writes this story in serial form over the course of 2 years. So basically every single week, she's going to publish just a little part of this in a newspaper. So imagine, what this was like, really. So popular books that are published, say like, Harry Potter or the Hunger Games or something, where you literally are only getting a chapter or, half a chapter a week. And you're sitting there waiting and anticipating the next one to come out, right? So people are really getting invested in this book. And it's not just a story, right? So it's an interesting story that people want to read more about. And they're trying to find out what happens next to Uncle Tom, which, was truly kind of revealed and the atrocities and how bad slavery is to the North. And in a way that Northerners didn't know before. Okay, so again, Northerners always considered slavery bad for a variety of reasons, but they just don't know how bad it is. But when it became an actual book or novel, right, because it's published in this complete form eventually, it was the best-selling book, right? There was only one book that sold better than Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the Bible. Okay, but pretty much everyone in the North read this book. It's going to be hugely significant. It brings an image of slavery to the North. It convinced Britain to remain neutral when the Civil War is actually going to happen. Because remember, Britain has outlawed slavery even earlier than the American Revolution, okay? And when Southerners found out about Uncle Tom's Cabin, they were offended. They were angered. They felt insulted. This book is making waves. Okay, so one thing you should know is that literature has the power to change the course of history, right? Common sense during the American Revolution influenced the Declaration of Independence, and Uncle Tom's Cabin will indeed be a lead up to the Civil War. Okay, in fact, when Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, he calls her the little lady who started the Civil War because she created so many abolitionists in the North. Okay. Now, even with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and many Northerners, are angered at slavery, we're still not ready to actually go fight the Civil War. Okay, so we're not quite sure that it's going to actually take violence in order to solve this problem. And so in 1852, the presidential election, we get a winner by the name of Franklin Pierce, a Democrat. And the reason why he won is because of his identity. Franklin Pierce is a Northern Democrat. He's going to get votes from the North because he's from the North, and he's going to get votes in the South or from Southerners because he's a Democrat. Okay, so he's, pretty much a shoo-in in 1852. So the election of Franklin Pierce, a president that you probably didn't even know existed because we really don't talk about him much, sort of shows us that the North and the South still are, amicable. They're not ready to fight each other. Okay, so they're not ready for war. They're looking for a compromise, which is why they voted for this Northern Democrat. Okay. However, after the election of Franklin Pierce, things are going to definitely get a little nastier between these two sections in the United States, okay? So the North and the South. And one of the big iconic events that leads to this is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, now Stephen Douglas is a senator from Illinois who wants to build a transcontinental railroad that crosses through his home state of Illinois. Okay, so here is Illinois. He wants to build a railroad that will go, cross through the Nebraska territory all the way to, California, because he thinks that his home state is going to gain a lot of money for that. Okay, so here's, again, Illinois. Now, in order to do that, he needs the rest of the land, right, the Louisiana Purchase territories to be organized. Okay, so they cannot just be territories. They have to be states in order for this plan to work. Okay, so he proposes something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this new law would allow something called popular sovereignty. So what this means, popular, which is what most people want, and sovereignty, which is your sort of power and freedom to kind of determine things for yourself. So essentially, the words popular sovereignty means that we're going to let the people decide. So we're going to give the people their freedom to make these decisions for themselves. And so that is going to let these territories of Kansas and Nebraska sort of vote to decide whether or not they would want slavery. Now, in theory, that sounds very democratic, right? It sounds good. Let the people vote, and, the people's voices are going to be heard. However, the Kansas Nebraska Act is going to be extremely controversial. Okay, now because the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you had north of that 3630 parallel line, the Missouri Compromise had already sort of made this decision of what Kansas and Nebraska would be if they were to become states. Okay, so they were supposed to be free. Now, everything north of that line is supposed to be free, and so when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in 1854, it overturns that compromise. Okay, so for the very first time since 1820, since the Missouri Compromise had been passed, slavery could possibly be allowed in the North. So if people vote to allow slavery in these territories, the North now could potentially have slavery. Okay, so this really changes the trajectory of the United States because now things are not the way they used to be. In fact, so many people are furious with the Whigs. Okay, so they were just so mad at the South. The Whig Party actually dies from all of their sort of infighting over this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And instead, it's going to be replaced with the political party that takes a stand against slavery in these territories. Okay, so while the Whig Party was primarily, popular in the North, the Whigs had no real stance on slavery. They were all about a strong federal government, banks, internal improvements, but they didn't ever say anything about slaves. Now it's time to abandon that Whig Party and make a new party that definitely has an opinion about slavery. And that new party is going to be the Republican Party. Okay, so the Republican Party is furious and outraged at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They cannot believe that slavery can or may exist in the North. And so this is really going to lead the Republican Party, now consisting of Northern Whigs. So people who used to identify as Northern Whigs, abolitionists and religious reformers, free soilers, inspired by the Second Great Awakening, the Republican Party truly has one goal, and that is to get rid of slavery in the United States, period. Okay, so that's it. So the formation of the Republican Party shows that the Civil War is sort of fast approaching. Okay, now the Republican Party, again, their only platform is anti-slavery. So they are exclusively in the North. You could be sure that there is not a single state in the South that is going to identify as Republican. Okay, and so what this creates is an even greater sectionalism. Before we had North versus South, yes, but there were still Northern Democrats, right? There were still Southern Whigs. There was still some of that existed. But now it looks like the North is Republican and the South is Democrat. Okay, now not only are they divided by their sectionalism, their different regions and economies and stuff, but the North and the South are now truly divided politically by parties, which can be very dangerous. Okay, and that will absolutely contribute to the start of the Civil War. Now, I want to cover 13.2 as well and tell you what happens with Kansas and a very important Supreme Court case. Okay, so analyze the causes and consequences of the battle over slavery in Kansas and the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case and the impact of those events on public opinion. So now that popular sovereignty is going to decide the fate of Kansas and Nebraska, tons of people start moving to Kansas because they want to live in Kansas so they can vote in those elections and determine what is going to happen as far as Kansas statehood. Will it be free or will it be slave? Now, Kansas is a hot topic because, if you look at Kansas, right, it's right next to Missouri. Okay, so here's the Kansas Territory, here's Missouri. And remember that people move in a westwardly fashion, right? So they're moving west and they have a tendency to do that. If people move from Missouri to Kansas, they will, take their property with them, right? And so Kansas has the potential of being a slave state. right? Not so much for the Nebraska territory, right? Because you have all of these, again, free states up here. If they're moving westward, that's not going to be so much the case. Nebraska is kind of, far up north. There's no real way that that's going to happen. But for sure, right, we're concerned about that Kansas territory. Okay, so now initially the border ruffians got to Kansas first. So the border ruffians are from Missouri, so they're right next door to Kansas. So they get there first and they write a constitution called the Lecompton Constitution that establishes Kansas as a free state. Okay, so excuse me, a slave state. So they want to make Kansas a slave state. So the Lecompton Constitution is going to establish that. Now, abolitionists are going to arrive to Kansas too, but they have to travel a little further. They're not right next door, right? So they're coming from places like Iowa and Illinois and Ohio. So it's going to take them longer to get there. So when the abolitionists get to Kansas, they say, hey, that's not fair. You guys write a constitution. We couldn't even get there. So abolitionists write the Topeka Constitution, saying that Kansas is going to be free. So you have these two different sets of laws that are both claiming to be legitimate laws for Kansas. So which one is it going to be? Congress orders Kansas to vote for these laws to determine which of them are going to, decide Kansas's system of government, and neither pass. And so for this reason, Kansas does not become a state anytime soon. It will actually remain a territory until 1861. However, in addition to voting and writing constitution, there's lots of different violent events that are happening all over Kansas. Even the United States, over the topic of Kansas, right, has all of these events that are breaking out, violent events. And we call this time period, as a result, Bleeding Kansas, from 1854 to 1858. So 4 years where there's just this crazy violence in Kansas among, border ruffians and these abolitionists. They're fighting each other, killing each other. You can see, all of these images with like guns pointed at each other. There's a lot of violence, even that's overflowing into Congress. Okay, so Congress, you have these, senators that are esteemed, and in Congress, you have senators actually beating each other over disagreements over what Kansas should be. Okay, so in this image right here, you see a representative from South Carolina. His name is Preston Brooks, and he's literally beating a Massachusetts senator, Charles Sumner, with a cane. And so the Southerner beating the Northerner over disagreements over Kansas, it's kind of funny. If you look in the back, you see all of these other politicians that are almost sort of laughing and amused and cheering these individuals on, right? So this time period was sort of known for its violence as a result of Bleeding Kansas, okay? Now, another event that's really going to divide the United States is going to be the Dred Scott case, or the Dred Scott decision. Okay, and the actual Supreme Court case is titled Dred Scott versus Sanford. So put a star next to this one, underline it, highlight it. This one is important. Okay, so another major event that leads up to the Civil War is Dred Scott. And now Dred Scott was a Southern slave. However, after living in the South with his owner takes him to the North, to Illinois, which was a free territory. And so Dred Scott says, hey, even though I'm your property, right now, because I am in the North where slavery does not exist, I should no longer be a slave. Okay, and Dred Scott sues his owner for his freedom in 1857. Now, unfortunately for Dred Scott, the person who is in charge of the Supreme Court is no longer John Marshall. Okay, so it is a new Supreme Court Chief Justice who is not going to be on Dred Scott's side. It is Chief Justice Roger Taney. Okay, so Roger Taney is the same Secretary of Treasury who killed the Bank of the United States for Andrew Jackson. Okay, so remember, as a thank you, Andrew Jackson practiced the spoils system and gave Roger Taney a position in the Supreme Court. Okay, so Roger Taney listens to the Dred Scott versus Sanford, and he rules that Dred Scott is going to still be a slave. Okay, and in fact, the Missouri Compromise that had declared the North as free is unconstitutional. So this is going to shake things up severely. Okay, so let's look at Roger Taney's sort of justification for that. So, number one, Dred Scott is property. And as property, first of all, he's not a citizen. Only citizens can sue in court. So Dred Scott versus Sanford should not even be a case, right? It shouldn't be sort of wasting time for the Supreme Court because Dred Scott doesn't have the ability to sue. Secondly, Roger Taney states that Congress could no longer prohibit slavery anywhere because states are the ones that have the authority to do so. So ever since the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, we have to abide by popular sovereignty. Okay, so Congress never should have even been able to pass the Missouri Compromise. And so for these reasons, Dred Scott is still a slave. Right? So the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And now states should sort of get to decide those things, okay, whether they're free or slave states. So Congress can no longer do that. Now you have to understand also the Constitution protects the, sort of legal actions of each state. So if you're living in California, for example, and you're married, right, or you buy property in California and you move to another state, that property still remains your property. Okay, so this is something that other states have to recognize about the legal actions in other states. So this is another reason why it's truly a significant court case, because if that's the case, people can buy legally slaves in slave states and now bring slaves to free states, according to the Dred Scott decision. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln, Republicans are furious, and this is only going to fuel the fire of Northern Republicans to try and crush slavery in the South, and it's going to lead us essentially to the Civil War. Okay, so we'll learn all about that soon and how this breaks out. But thank you for joining me for this first part.